Welcome back, everyone, to Inclusive Design 24 2025, brought to you in partnership with our Platinum supporters, Accessibility Cloud and Intopia. You can follow us on Mastodon and Blue Sky. If you have any questions for the presenters, please feel free to post them using the ID24 hashtag, or you can use the chat feature in YouTube. And we'll handle your questions for Q&A at the end of the session. Quick reminder that ID24 is a respectful community, and you can find our code of conduct on the Inclusive Design 24 website. Now I'm happy to be joined by our guest host, Makoto Ueki. Please take it away, Makoto.
Hi, hello from Tokyo. Let me introduce our next speaker. Next, we have Nic Chan talking Audiom, building inclusive maps as the token-cited developer. Over to you, Nic.
Sorry, I just realized I had my mic muted. Is that working now? Okay. I just wanted to say thank you to the ID24 team for having me. It's always a conference I tune into every year because it's time zone friendly, so it's a really big honor to be speaking. I just want the audience to know that I have a love-hate relationship with speaking about accessibility. I love it because I never shut up about it, but I hate it because I will inevitably stumble over the pronunciation of the word accessibility at least a few times in this talk, so please forgive me when this happens. Okay, so the title of the talk is Audium, Building Inclusive Maps as a Token-Cited Developer. My name is Nic Chan, and my socials are up on the screen there. So I wanted to address the elephant in the room. I want to apologize for picking a title that I know is spicy, but if you are here listening to this talk, it does mean that clickbait, unfortunately, does work. From my personal experience in web development, most teams are mostly non-disabled people, primarily building software that we might say is meant for everyone, but in reality turns out to be mostly for other non-disabled people. And disabled people are an afterthought, despite the best efforts of advocates of folks like you. And this is my experience too, right? I'm often a lone advocate at various places, making compromises that I don't want to make. Alternatively, I'd be a remediator, brought on after an organization has already received a legal complaint. Audium was different. Apart from me, Audium consists of a team of all blind developers. And as a result, my experience at Audium was so different to the experiences I had in the past that I thought it would be worth giving a talk on the insights I learned from this experience. This talk is aimed at those with some prior knowledge in the accessibility field. It assumes you have at least a little knowledge on what things like WCAG and keyboard focus are. If you don't understand this yet, bookmark this talk and come back later. To give you a brief introduction, my name is Nic Chan. I'm an independent front-end developer from Hong Kong. I make up one half of Ultramarina, where we just launched an accessible Shopify theme called Primavera, so check it out if you're interested. And I am available for hire. I specialize in general front-end web development or accessibility consulting, so reach out if you're interested. Okay, on to maps. Those of you in the accessibility industry might know that accessibility of map widgets is bad. It's so bad that everyone just says you should do a skip link and then describe it in text. So on the screen here, we have what web authors might do with a standard map widget. You have the widget, and then above that, you have a skip link that would allow keyboard users or screen reader users to just bypass it completely. And then below it, you have some alternative text. An example of that alternative text might read something like map of the Space Needle in Seattle, Washington, and the surrounding area. But that doesn't really fulfill the purpose of a map. Yes, a table or really good alt text might give you the same basic information, but it can't really answer questions about spatial relationships and how parts of the world connect. Most map widgets allow you to explore beyond the main point of the map in order to provide greater context. In regular map widgets, blind users are denied this experience. So we come to the question of what Audium is. Audium is an accessible map interface that includes multiple different modes of interaction. It aims to be WCAG AAA compliant and undergoes constant development and testing cycles with blind users. And to do all of this, it uses conventions and UX patterns pioneered in blind video games, and is backed by academic research into accessible mapping done by the CEO. If a sighted user was using an established map widget like Google Maps, they would have multiple ways of interacting with a web map and its objects. Instead of translating those methods directly to create a blind experience, Audium takes the time to think about the blind and low vision user experience from the ground up. To give you a brief idea of how to use Audium, each map always has a visual avatar, and that represents your current position in the virtual world. That's the blue dot in the center of the screen right here. There are two different interaction modes that both use the arrow keys, either the physical arrow keys on your keyboard or button arrow keys that will show up if you use a touchscreen, so it's accessible for mobile screen reader users as well. Grid mode is a more verbose mode that will say what you're standing on as you move your avatar over it, and in that mode you can only move in the 4 cardinal directions. First person mode will let you turn and rotate like you're in a video game, and that will mainly use sound cues and footsteps, and those will increase and decrease in volume as you move towards and away from objects. It's a more experiential way of describing space, which is more similar to what a blind person would experience in the offline world. There are multiple other ways of interacting with objects in the world. You have menus, like what you would see on the right side of the screen. It has a list of the objects in the world, and then where they are in relation to the avatar. So how many steps away you are from it, and in what direction are those steps. You also have radars, which will play different beeps as you get closer or farther away from an object. It's used for finding objects. It's much like that children's game, Marco Polo. And you have point-to-point routing, which more closely resembles general map widgets, and it would let you put in a point and then path to it. As someone who plays a lot of video games, I've found this way of navigating to be quite intuitive, even as someone who has no prior experience with blind audio maps or blind video games. So, now that we've established that Audium is a product by blind developers for primarily blind users, I think it's time to reiterate that I'm not a blind developer. I'm sighted. So how did I end up on this project? On 2021, I gave a talk at the W3C workshop on the state of accessibility in web map widgets. Seeing that I was one of like maybe 10 people who work on maps, front-end development, and accessibility, Brandon brought me on shortly afterwards to work on the WCAG compliance of Audium. It soon became clear that the visual aspect of Audium was going to be very important to the success of the product. Even if visuals are not that important to the core audience of blind users, a lot of people who make key decisions about whether or not to adopt new technologies are sighted. Unless they're also accessibility experts, sighted people generally have difficulty understanding and evaluating audio interfaces. So the sighted interface becomes a measuring stick for the quality of the audio interface, no matter how unfair we find that. So then my role went from auditing to development, and that's how I became the token sighted developer on the team. While I was there, I worked on pretty much everything visual, doing UI for things like touch interface, the route following, the settings panel, things like that. So now that we all know what Audium is, it's time to move on to the main point of this talk, which is what I learned from this experience. I'm going to be grouping these into 3 loose themes. We have industry and organizational barriers, knowledge and assumptions, and beyond WCAG and accessibility standards. Our first theme is industry and organizational barriers. One of the biggest things this experience highlighted for me is just how inefficient accessibility as an industry is. This isn't because of the practitioners or the subject matter, it's because of the uphill battle that we collectively face trying to convince stakeholders that accessibility actually matters. So much of our energy is wasted on conversations about why we have to do accessibility. And once you've convinced people that accessibility is important, then a lot of the energy will shift to what is the absolute minimum level of accessibility we can do here. I'm sure some folks may have had the experience where you've seen a design where the color contrast is just inaccessible in some areas. And when you point it out, instead of just opting for greater contrast, people ask for an alternative with the minimum possible contrast. And then you just have to waste hours of your day hunting through the design system, seeing what colors are on top of each other in order to give a real answer. This just feels like a lot of wasted effort. So all this leads to the question, what would our industry look like if accessibility was a given instead of an afterthought? This likely isn't news to anyone here, but it's so tiring to be in the position where you have to say no all the time. Constantly fighting ableism is exhausting. Even if you're not disabled, it's always frustrating to try to convince others to care about the humanity and dignity of others. One thing I've realized through talks and written materials by folks like Jerry Reed, Amy Hupe, and Devin Persing is that burnout can often happen not as a result of too much work, but from occupying what we might call a villain role in the workspace. The dynamic where the accessibility person is a villain of the organization goes away completely once you start to say accessibility is a hard requirement. If it's not accessible, it doesn't ship. Then you can really free up all that time you spent convincing people and instead do high impact things like testing with real users, trying to find the best way to make something accessible as possible, rather than fighting over doing the bare minimum. I found this dynamic change at Audium to be really healing for the soul. Even though this was an incredibly productive period of my life in terms of pure output, it didn't take the toll on me the way that other work did, because I didn't feel like I was constantly pushing the boulder up the hill. All that's to say, if you get the chance to work on software where accessibility is a core value, I think you should take it. You probably won't regret it. My key takeaway here is this. If you find yourself burnt out from doing accessibility work, question if it really is the kind or amount of work that is burning you out, or the circumstances under which you are performing that work. One thing that is even truer for organizations like Audium is that procurement sucked. Regardless of who is behind the business, every business probably needs some kind of software to run. Because our team was mostly blind, in our case, everything from accounting, invoicing, communications, time tracking, all this needs to be screen reader accessible. Unfortunately, accessibility as a hard requirement in procurement eliminates like 80% of the options from the market. The vast majority of small software is just off the table completely because they've prioritized other things over making sure their software is truly accessible. The software that we could use tended to be enterprise software. Larger organizations often have things like contracts with government or education, two sectors that typically have legal requirements about using accessible software. Even if the software wasn't fully accessible, at least we would have some kind of recourse or guarantee that we could point to in order to make progress. I'd like to take a moment to introduce the concept of the disability or accessibility tax. Maybe some of the audience has heard of the concept of the pink tax, which is essentially gender-based price discrimination, where women have to pay more for equivalent products. This tax is not a literal tax where disabled people pay more money to the government. It's a form of cultural taxation, the systemic idea that disabled people need to pay more to access society. In this specific case, we basically always had to spring for the most established, largest software option, even if it wasn't the best fit for our needs in terms of features or functionality, just because the need for access trumped every other factor. Larger, more established products cost more money, and so it ends up being a form of the disability tax. There might not be an evil supervillain-esque figure rubbing their hands together at the idea of charging disabled people more, but the end result is still the same. Even with legal requirements in place that would guarantee that at least some software would be accessible, It is not uncommon for disabled users to experience a bait and switch, where they would start using a service and then realize that certain functionality was just not accessible. In the end, we ended up using a simple spreadsheet for a lot of things, like timekeeping. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to say that you should use a spreadsheet for everything, but if the main thing your software adds is a shiny user interface over a database, then don't be surprised if people opt for the spreadsheet version when they can't use that shiny interface at all. As a sighted person, I'm not used to being excluded from using services on this scale. Because I use this tablet pen as my pointer device, there is software I often have to stop using due to the lack of scroll bars, but I generally get to use most things without an issue. Also, as an accessibility person, I do generally know that most websites are not good, but both of these things could not actually prepare me for the scale of mass exclusion that we faced. While on the topic of procurement, regardless of size, code libraries tended to have major accessibility issues. I think the team had valid reasons for wanting to use an existing UI library. They loved the idea of an abstraction where they didn't have to personally worry about the styling that they couldn't see. It would have been ideal to just worry about gluing the parts together without worrying about the details, especially the visual details. We would use code libraries that were used by millions of people, but then find accessibility issues quickly, suggesting a lack of thorough testing with disabled users. These libraries were advertising themselves as accessible, but they wouldn't include details on how the library would live up to these claims, or include a proper accessibility statement. Also, some libraries would reference using the ARIA Authoring Practices Guide, also known as the APG, not understanding that the APG is a guide for how to use ARIA, not a guide for how to author accessible components. A wonderfully phrased sentiment by my fellow accessibility specialist, Hide de Vries. The ways in which these UI libraries failed was often interesting and revealing. For example, we used a popular table library that used virtualized row rendering, which is a technique for only rendering the table rows when they're in view to enhance performance. However, there was a fatal flaw that navigating the table with the keyboard would cause the headers and the rows to be out of sync once you started using the keyboard to traverse the cells, as pictured here. This is an issue that would be quite difficult to solve, even if we modified the source. So we ended up using a native HTML element for the table, and then paginating what was shown. The main takeaway here is to treat all mega libraries with caution. If you don't need every single feature, then don't include a library that does every single feature, because each new feature is a surface area for accessibility issues. One thing I really want to highlight in this talk is the flaws with the standard build the thing and then test it approach that most organizations have. What happens often with organizations is that they will go through the entire software lifecycle before bringing on disabled users. Even with Audium, when we had a third-party vendor brought on to do some work for us, they knew of the mission and the importance of accessibility to us, but the end result that they delivered was just not accessible. I can't personally know what this vendor was thinking. I imagine it was something like, it's just going to be a few tweaks in the end, and the people I'm doing this for have the expertise to be able to correct me, so I won't worry about it. But it was actually really difficult for the disabled members of the team to test the end output, because sometimes you won't know that there are accessibility barriers because the nature of the barrier makes it invisible to disabled users. For example, I saw an inaccessible dropdown where the expandable element was coded as a link, so a screen reader user would think that it was a normal link. But a sighted keyboard-only user, when they activated the link, they would kind of see that flash of other links appearing under it. They just wouldn't be able to access it. Only a mouse user was able to toggle the expandable element and then have access to the sublinks. All in all, this was an interesting inversion of the typical accessibility testing dynamic. It ultimately took me, a sighted person, to say that the experience that I'm getting as a sighted person is not matching the experience of the screen reader user. How can we fix that? Yes, it's really important to know if a disabled person can use the product at all. But it's also important to make sure that we haven't created invisible barriers due to our assumptions. This is why context is so important in addition to knowledge. Disabled users can't really test something if something is accessible or not unless they have the necessary context and awareness of what the product does. Otherwise, they could be hitting barriers without even realizing it. This is why it is so important to have disabled people included as early on in the process as possible, ideally in every step of the process. Otherwise, we end up trying to validate our assumptions about what constitutes good accessible design. And that leads us into our next section, knowledge and assumptions. Early on in the project, I found something that made me laugh out loud. A keyboard-only combo box. A combo box, for those of you who might not know, is an interface component that lets you select from a list of predefined values, or you can type a value in. The combo box I found on Audium, which is not the one pictured here by the way, didn't respond to click events at all, only keyboard events. It was also completely unstyled, which meant that for me, it appeared super broken. My first response was to laugh at the absurdity. How many people can say they've encountered a component where the developer forgot about the existence of mouse users? I think this can only be funny to me because it's the exact opposite of what happens most of the time. Here, the blind team had accidentally excluded me as a sighted person. But precisely because I am sighted, I have the privilege of being able to use most interfaces. If it were something that I experienced every day, my reaction would probably change from amusement to frustration at the systemic exclusion. I got to have the tiniest taste as what it's like to experience a web even more broken than the one that sighted users experience. While I was fixing up the combo box, I then realized something else. What makes an MVP a minimum viable product is completely relative to the person making it and the audience they seek to make it for. When we ask ourselves, who is this viable for? We're asking questions about who is or isn't included in the process of making our products. Forcing stakeholders to articulate who is or isn't included can be a powerful way to advocate for inclusive design. This next point requires a bit more background, so let's return to story mode for a second. As a one-sighted person on the team, reviewing visual designs just got rolled up into the list of things that I would do for Audium. While I'm not a designer by trade, I do have more design knowledge than the average developer, so this worked out okay for our team. I have enough knowledge to be able to extend a brand identity to a web application design, and I have enough skills to make sure that the map of this playground isn't overlaid on top of Europe and Africa, as you see here on the slides. On the screen now is a before and after of when I started to work on the UI. To an audio-only user, the interface is identical, but it did change a lot for a sighted user. As a developer, getting to play the role of designer for once is thankfully both fun and challenging for me personally. But here's the thing, I get to choose what I specialize in. I get to say, this is something that really interests me, and I'm going to invest my time into learning more about it. Disabled people often don't have the same choice. Because of how inaccessible the internet is, disabled people might have to become specialists in their assistive technology or in figuring out hacks just to be able to do regular tasks. It's like if everyone had to use Linux to use a computer. Sure, there are some people that really love Linux, but there are many people who simply wouldn't bother if using Linux was a minimum requirement to use a computer. Going back to the concept of the disability tax, even though this doesn't involve literal money, we can think of the idea of having to invest additional time and resources to be able to achieve the same basic needs as a kind of experiential disability tax. My main point here is to challenge the idea that disabled people are automatically accessibility experts. This is not to say that disabled people lack knowledge on accessibility, but to point out the fact that when you ask someone to be an accessibility expert, there's a bunch of different subspecialties and discrete experiences that are all grouped together in one term. Here on the slide, we have an example graphic from gov.uk. I'm not including it here for us to read the details, but you can see from a high level that it identifies different accessibility needs for 6 different groups, such as autistic users, screen reader users, low vision users, and more. Just like it's not really realistic for companies to demand that a single web developer become an expert on everything, ranging from back-end, front-end, performance, security, user experience, and other subspecialties, we need to recognize that accessibility expertise covers many overlapping but discrete experiences. One time, I was chatting with the founder, Brandon, about our heat map implementation. For those of you who might not know, a heat map is basically a map that uses colors to represent different stepped values for a data visualization. So typically speaking, a more intense color would represent a higher value, and a less intense color would represent a lower value. In an earlier iteration of this heat map component, we had received some feedback that the color values we had chosen didn't have enough color contrast. Brandon was asking me why we couldn't just change the colors so that it would have enough contrast. If I might remind you, Brandon is blind and has written several papers on accessible mapping, so he definitely is a subject matter expert. But blind and low vision needs, even though they both deal with vision issues, aren't exactly the same. And I had to explain to Brandon why having a contrasty enough color scale with more than 3 colors is literally impossible. So here's what I mean by impossible. Let's take pure white, the lightest possible color, as our starting point, pictured on the left here. If we tweak the lightness values to find the shade of gray with a minimum 3:1 contrast ratio, we then get this middle shade of gray. If we repeat the same process, adjusting it to create a 3:1 contrast ratio, we then get this darker shade of gray on the right here. But then that's basically it. We can't go to black. The contrast ratio of black and that darker shade of gray is around 2. So unfortunately, no matter how you slice and dice it, you can only get a maximum of 3 color stops with adequate contrast, which is not enough color stops to make most data visualizations. Once I explained it like this, then Brandon understood that this was a problem of the limitations of color, not of how we were implementing color. Mixed ability teams can help to fill in each other's knowledge gaps. So in the end, what we had for our heat map was a legend that would let you toggle colors and patterns individually. There's just no way we can design a color range that would let us have the contrast required, but having this customizable experience, people can choose what would work for them. So users who find patterns overwhelming might choose to just show the colors, but users who need the highest contrast possible might opt for patterns only. Notice how we don't label these as something like low vision mode or cognitive disability mode. We label them as show patterns and show colors. Individual experiences of disability are personal enough that we'd prefer to just provide the tools used to control the experience, without making assumptions about who is using the experience. There is a social reason behind this as well. People may not use the terms we expect to describe their experiences. For example, colorblind people might not identify with the low vision label, but they might benefit from being able to use patterns instead of color. Describing what is being changed instead of assigning an identity to it is ultimately more inclusive. Going back to the main point, this is exactly what I mean when I say every person will have gaps in their knowledge. There isn't going to be a singular perfect accessibility expert because knowledge has inherent limitations. It's like trying to classify the human experience. You can probably make some generalizations, but it's not going to be true for everyone. Disabled people aren't any different in this aspect. I've heard of some organizations that end up heavily relying on a single disabled individual to give them the all clear legally, and oftentimes that disabled person might not even have an accessibility role. It's like if you grabbed a random person off your team and then told them to be your designer. It might work out, kind of did in our case, but there's a bigger chance of it not actually working out. And I think that's why our industry ends up focusing so much on things like WCAG and compliance standards. Drawing a discrete line around this area of usability and knowledge then makes it easier for stakeholders to understand, even if the end result is that it still results in access issues. Finally, that leads us into our last section, beyond WCAG and standards. Just to bring things back to the development side for a second, it was interesting to be able to try things that I had never touched in my 10 years as a web developer. The first thing that I want to mention is the role equals application attribute. Role equals application is somewhat infamous in our industry, and the vast majority of advice out there is really simple. People say, just don't use it at all. The truth is, most use cases are just not complex enough to warrant using role equals application. It is strictly for emulating desktop apps. But what happens when your application is actually complicated enough to warrant it? In our case, the element that has role equals application is just a wrapper around the little avatar that is displayed in the center of each map. And that's activated when you focus on the element, either through keyboard or mouse. It might not look like much, but the audio map has over 70 unique keyboard shortcuts that can be used just from this button. One thing I wish more people realized about role equals application is that it's not an all or nothing scenario. In Audium, many of the keyboard shortcuts just trigger different menus that follow conventional HTML patterns. There isn't a need to completely reinvent the wheel if we just move focus between the visual avatar and the rest of the web application as needed. The standardized web UI components can do the heavy lifting for us. This way, you get the best of both worlds. You get the custom functionality as allowed by role equals application, along with the familiarity of standard web interfaces. However, if you ask me if I would recommend this approach, I would be pretty cautious. Sure, it looks right to me, but by now we should all be well aware of the pitfalls of overvaluing your own individual experience. The only thing that makes me feel certain that we're not messing everything up for users is the fact that our development process includes rigorous testing with focus groups of mixed ability. Things should be built to web standards, of course, but standards don't mean anything if they aren't usable. Another technology I hadn't previously worked with much are the web APIs surrounding audio, including the Web Audio API and the Web MIDI API. Some of the audience have probably touched the Web Audio API in the past, but if you're anything like me, you haven't done much more than playing or stopping a sound. The Web Audio API is extraordinarily powerful and can do things beyond what you can probably imagine. The timing controls are so granular and precise that you can even play and make music with it. But one thing I've come to realize while working at Audium is that audio doesn't just have to be for fun or for flavor. I'm not saying that you should go and add audio to every part of your site. Audio on the web is definitely doing more harm than good presently, with intrusive notifications and distracting auto-playing video. However, I do think there is untapped potential to explore the idea of audio as a potential accessibility tool. One cool thing the Audium team did was to implement a sonifier for data tables. Take this example table that shows COVID cases. The highest value for cases is the United States, with over 1.2 million cases. The lowest value on this chart is Taiwan, with just 440 cases. For charts like this, where the highest number is several orders of magnitude higher than the lowest number, it can be really difficult for users with dyscalculia to understand how much larger that large number is. A sonifier can be used to convert numbers to musical tones. A larger number might play a higher tone, and then a lower number would play a lower tone. It's basically the audio form of the heat map we've discussed earlier. Once we've sonified the data, traversing the map or the table would then play this corresponding tone. And this could support different user needs. It could help users with cognitive issues better conceptualize the numbers in relation to each other, or screen reader users can hear the sound as a kind of summary if the numbers are getting really verbose. Though this idea isn't completely novel, I've never really seen this technique used in other places. I encourage the audience, especially my fellow sighted developers, to think more broadly about the possibilities for accessible UIs beyond a direct translation of the sighted interface to the audio interface. All this begs the question, if WCAG is the floor, what can we do to make more accessible websites? Working on an accessibility first project taught me the importance of the little details that make an experience more accessible. The next slide will include a moving GIF where I open a select and then browse through some of the options. Feel free to look away if this is distracting. I will let you know when it's over. So this slide just has a GIF that depicts first letter navigation, which is a technique where when the select is open, pressing a letter, for example, the letter A, would cycle through the options that start with the letter A. The GIF is now over. You can look at the slides now. Depending on your auditor, you might not fail a WCAG audit if you don't include first letter navigation in your custom select component. But first letter navigation is absolutely essential for screen reader and keyboard-only users to filter through the options. If you have more than 5 elements, consider first letter navigation an absolute necessity. It's things like this that really highlight the different kinds of feedback you get from accessibility testers trying to test against a specification, and feedback you get from real disabled users. First letter navigation isn't officially in the WCAG, but it's an established best practice for keyboard users. This kind of difference is a recurring trend. With accessibility testers, we'd often get into long back and forth where we'd debate the semantics of the specification, but we'd never receive an example of how this would affect real users. Real user feedback is the opposite. Not every issue that's brought up is necessarily an accessibility issue that you have to fix, but people are keen to share the ways in which product decisions affect them personally. Real user feedback is how you transform a good product into a great one. WCAG, while a great tool for reaching a particular baseline, isn't a guidebook for how to build good experiences. It's the minimum floor. I just want to give one final anecdote that I hope will explain my point a bit better. One time, I was rushing through a feature and I quickly threw together a navigation for it. The navigation consisted of a nav element with multiple anchor links, or A tags, as direct children of that element. I know this is wrong. If I had taken a bit more time to think about it, I probably would have caught it right off the bat. But I think the reason why I didn't catch it to start is because of 2 things. The first being, once this was styled, it looked right to me. I had over-indexed on my experience as a sighted user to say that it was probably fine when it was not. This is the accessibility version of it works on my machine. The second reason why I forgot it is because the reason why this code example is bad wasn't sticky enough in my brain. If you ask an accessibility expert, they might say something like, the first example is bad because the code isn't semantic. They might point to the HTML specification where it says you should use list markup to aid understanding and navigation. But while I personally know this isn't an explanation that actually sticks in my brain. The person who rejected my pull request put it much more simply. He said, the problem with what you have is that the screen reader will read it all on one line. Even though I've visually styled the items to be separated, by default, the anchor element is an inline element, so the screen reader will read it in a single breath, something like link home, link about, link contact. Putting it in an unordered list will read out the total item count, and then it will let you traverse each item one by one. Though a skilled screen reader user will know how to get around UI flaws like this, they shouldn't have to. Once the developer told me that, something clicked in my brain. Having a concrete example of how an abstract concept like semantics impacts the user experience can help to make important accessibility concepts easier to remember. And I think that's something our industry really needs to improve on communicating why things are a bad experience. Knowing what things are WCAG violations is really important, but knowing what problems they will cause is equally valuable. So we've reached the end of my talk. Here are some takeaways I've rounded up in a single list. Organizational support might be the cure to your burnout. Forcing stakeholders to articulate who is or isn't included in the definition of a minimal viable product can be a powerful way to advocate for inclusive design. Accessibility knowledge encompasses so many different experiences and subspecialties. Defining features by what they do instead of who it supports can help to expand your user base. And inclusive design requires inclusion. It's in the name. Thank you so much. I've put my socials on the screen. Feel free to reach out to me at my website, nicchan.me, if you want to continue the conversation or dig up the socials from the ID24 website. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. That was a great talk, very informative. And you probably already mentioned it, but just to reiterate, you can find this project on audiom.net. Is that right?
Yeah.
Right. And I've been looking at it while you were presenting and trying the demo out and stuff like that. It was really engaging and interesting.
Mhm.
I had a few questions.
Mhm.
I know from experience that when you try to really get this kind of custom interaction style to, specifically for people with disabilities, in a way that is way beyond what WCAG requires or any other
Mhm.
standard requires, you tend to end up in a situation where you talk to, in this case, people on the project who are blind and they have their research and their experience and their personal preferences. And then once you start showing your project around, you show it to other people, and then you get somebody else who is blind or has some other disability, who has completely different expectations, and maybe even requirements and different preferences. How do you deal with these kind of personal levels of feedback? Like, how do you weigh one opinion from one person to the other when there isn't a
Mhm.
broadly carried base of what a standard requires, for example?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not too involved in the testing side, but I think one thing that really helps is the volume of testing, right? Like if you only test with 5 users, it's sort of hard to get a sense of does that really represent maybe like a majority of opinions? Where if you test with like, hundreds of users and you're constantly getting feedback, you can more easily identify trends. And one thing I would also consider is like does that feedback break down into particular groups? For example, Audium lets you use your screen reader, and so it will announce everything through like a live region, or you can use the web text to speech. And most experienced users will almost certainly prefer the live region because their screen reader will be speaking at the rate and pitch and accent or whatever that they prefer their experience to be. But maybe people who are not so tech savvy, don't really use a screen reader, but would still benefit from something like Audium, would choose text to speech because then they don't have to fiddle with setting up a screen reader or something like that.
Right. And I guess people are really set in their ways quite often. And that's what I
Mhm.
really liked about this project is that something that tends to be controversial, like auditory icons,
Mhm.
where a lot of people will say, I don't want this constant dinging or binging in my ears and not being able to hear what my screen reader is saying. And in this case, it's a feature that you have, but you can turn it on or off. You have all these different options like the first person kind of navigation style and different navigation styles so that it's available, but it's not forced on anybody and people can have their own kind of personal way of doing it.
Mhm.
You also mentioned running into issues with procurement for the big UI frameworks, like the issues that you ran into, like that table where the virtualized scrolling was enabled and the column headers got out of alignment. Like, do you log those issues to those frameworks and then follow up with them, or are you just so pressed for time that you just move on to whatever's next or whatever alternative you come up with? And how would you recommend other teams that are in a similar situation to deal with these kind of issues? Like, what's the best approach to actually get these fixed?
Hmm. I think generally we've tended to log these issues, but in most cases, like if it's not something that's really fundamental, like if it's not a screen reader issue or a browser issue, we kind of don't expect them to fix it in a timeline that works for us. So, if it's a UI library, we might report it but we'll probably migrate or find something else. Where if it's something like a browser issue, or a combination of browser and AT, then that's something that we will really kind of take the time to work through. I know there are often problems with basically live regions. I've written a blog post about it. They're not consistently announced because there's language in the specification that says the live region might clear the previous announcements if you're starting to build a backlog. And so while there's techniques around it, it's not ideal because you want there to be like almost no latency, like for something like this. You don't want there to be a delay as you're walking around on what's announced. And so something like that, we're happy to just poke jaws and see if they're open to changing it, or maybe with the ARIA Notify API, there'll be some changes there. It's something I really hope for.
Yeah, definitely will be more reliable.
Mhm.
The funny thing is that your team or teams like your team are probably in the best position to actually really understand and run into these issues, whereas the people from those framework libraries, they will do a certain level of testing and they probably will miss a lot of these. But if you're using it at a practical level and you're on a day-to-day basis, you run into the real, the real friction points of using that framework. So it's
Mhm.
probably invaluable to, for any team that has disabled developers, for example, on their team to share that information, because that's where the real life experience comes in. Makoto, did you have any questions?
Yeah, I don't see any question on the social medias like Mastodon and Blue Sky. I think it's due to time differences, so more people will watch your presentation afterward. So
Mhm.
please keep watching social medias. And I liked your talk, especially about beyond compliance, beyond WCAG. Could you please share your secret of success when you get feedback from users?
Hmm. It's interesting. I think trying to distill user feedback into something actionable really requires you to understand where that feedback is coming from.
Mhm.
And I think sometimes maybe when people submit feedback, they might just say, like, this doesn't work or something is not ideal for me. And then maybe you have to do like some discovery work there, like, okay, so what technologies are you trying to use it with? What specific feature are you trying to use? And kind of um, then taking that feedback and trying to look at overall trends, right? Like, is this a bug? Is this something that people are consistently asking for and it's not included? That can be a way to turn feedback into more actionable things. But I'm definitely more on the developer side. So by the time feedback gets to me, it's already kind of been decided what we should act on and what we shouldn't.
Okay, thanks. And we got a comment on YouTube. Congrats on Audium XR navigation for being a 2025 Gaddy's Award winner. Congratulations. But could you please tell us briefly about what the Gaddy's Award is?
I actually don't have any idea on this. I don't work with Audium presently. This was kind of an experience I did in 2021 to
Oh,
2023,
okay.
something like this.
Mhm.
But it's really great to hear that they've been picking up awards and able to continue on, even though I'm not actively involved in the day-to-day anymore. Happy to support the team and Brandon's efforts.
Mhm. Thank you so much. Okay, that's all for now. Hans?
Yeah, we've mostly been getting, praise for your talk so far in the comments. So thanks again for this great talk, and I will do my wrap up. If you like this session, hit the YouTube like button. Don't forget that you can subscribe to our channel to be kept in the loop on future events. Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you with thanks to our Platinum supporters, Accessibility Cloud and Intopia, our Silver supporters, Intuit, and our Bronze supporters, the Law Office of Laney Feingold, Mantis & Co., and Vispero. Inclusive Design 24 will be back on the hour with our next session. See you then. Thanks again, Nick.
Stay tuned.